everybody. Okay, well, I want to, well, first, welcome back. Uh, I want to continue with our discussion on Galveston Bay. And if you'll remember, in part one of this series of lectures, we started talking about Galveston Bay, primarily focused on its history and a little bit about its ecosystem, and wrapped up last class period talking a little bit about Galveston Bay's geology. And again, the geology of the bay, the geology of the coast is really interesting and affects the hydrology, which is likewise interesting. So we are still in this section here, coastal environment, section B, and we're going to be wrapping up today talking about hydrology, habitats, and then a little bit about current status. Okay, so again, I think the hydrology of the bay is really interesting and in a lot of ways unique, but in a lot of ways mirrors other like type barrier island type bays. You know, the coastal geology that we talked about, especially the sedimentary nature of the soils, the physical shape and bathymetry of the bay, coupled to the freshwater inputs and saltwater inputs that we're going to talk about are make the bay a unique environment and a very productive one, as we've discussed. So you remember Galveston Bay is very shallow, and the tides, to a great extent, are wind driven or controlled by the wind. But in terms of water inputs, essentially, we've got two large freshwater inflows, the largest being the Trinity River, and that watershed extends clear up to Dallas, Fort Worth, so Denton County, like we've discussed, and then the smaller of the two being the San Jacinto River. Now, these aren't the only two. In fact, there are a number of smaller bayous and creeks that feed in around the bay, all the way down here from the very south end of the bay where it meets up with Follett Island, all the way around and clear over here into East Bay. There's also a significant amount of sheet flow from our uh, inland wetlands and water features. So we'll talk a little bit more about that a couple of times over the semester. That actually has some significance in terms of water quality and the habitats that we find, how they interlink. So we're going to come back to that though. All right. So you've got this fresh water coming in, and then we've got multiple sources of salt water that find their way in from the Gulf of Mexico. Now, as I said, these two are the predominant freshwater inflow sources. They're the ones that really have a significant effect up here in the upper part of the bay, and they're responsible to a great extent for the salinity gradient that's there. Um, so in terms of saltwater inputs, there are two current day. Okay, so today, you know, you would find saltwater moving in through Bolivar Roads, which is right here between Port Bolivar and the east end of Galveston Island. This is where the Houston Ship Channel comes through. And in fact, this image looks like it caught a boat and then finds its way all, or it might be the end of the dike in any event. A little too small for my eyes to see. So anyway, so you've got the Houston Ship Channel that comes in here, goes all the way up to the San Jacinto River, and then down on the far west end of the island, you have San Luis Pass. If you've been down there, and this is an interesting pass in part because you get these tidal deltas that occur here because the nature of this pass is pretty shallow. And so you can actually see in this image here some channels. Now, if you were to go back down to San Luis Pass on a regular basis over several months or over a few years, what you'll find is that where this channel is will move. The channel actually relocates, especially after big flood events. So whether that's fresh water moving its way out or salt water pushing its way in because of a storm, this channel will redistribute this sediment, which is fairly erodible. Also, because of this, the tidal elements that are regularly moving through here, pardon me, um, you'll have we have this flood tidal delta. So that tide, that incoming tide, actually redistributes sediment inside of this channel. There's also an ebb tidal delta. It's much smaller out here, but so you have sediments that are moved in and out of this channel as they're being redistributed. You'll find deltas a lot of times, river deltas that form like the end of the Mississippi River has in fact, much of the southern part of Louisiana is actually built on a river delta sediment that's been moved down the river and then deposited. And there's actually a really small one up here at the mouth of the Trinity River as well. So we got a little delta there. But this is kind of a neat feature. So in any event, there was, for many years, a third saltwater input, and that was Rollover Pass, located in Gilchrist on Bolivar Peninsula. That was a man-made pass. It was referred to as a fish pass, so it was it was an ingress and egress for fish to get back and forth up into East Bay. I'm going to say that was constructed maybe in the 40s or 50s, but don't quote me on that. I'm doing that from memory. I should have looked before I started this presentation. In any event, it has been closed recently because not only was the channel starting to fail, it had steel sheet pile along each side to line it with, and it had a number of issues, but it also presented somewhat of a hazard during storms. And there was a significant amount of concern about it altering, the salt water moving into East Bay, which historically didn't have that channel. This would be relatively fresh. There is a lot of freshwater sheet flow that comes off of this part of Chambers County moves, so if you're familiar with where the Anahuac National Wildlife Refuge is, there's a lot of water that moves out of there and finds its way into East Bay. So historically, that would have been quite fresh. But because of that fish path, there was quite a bit of salt water getting in there. So there was concerns about how that might be altering the ecosystem over a long period of time. Okay, and there's that rollover pass right there, that little guy. So, all right, so we have previously talked about salinity gradients. And so I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on that here, other than to acknowledge that it does have a significant impact on the hydrology of the bay, whether water's moving in or moving out, depending on what's going on with the inflows, and both the freshwater inflows and the saltwater inflows. So that salinity gradient is a byproduct of those flows, right? So typically, you will see salinity represented. I would say most commonly, you're going to see it represented either as parts per thousand, so you'll see PPT after it, followed by PSU, which are practical salinity units. And for all practical purposes, come on. So um, uh, PSU and PPT are the same thing, right? And so I do have a link to an article here if you want to read a little bit more about that relationship. You will also see salinity represented in milligrams per liter. That is very common, same thing as parts per thousand. So here in the US, though, I would say PPT is still probably the most common thing, although I see PSU more and more often because most of our instrumentation. So, for instance, one of my favorite Datason, HANA Datason, represents salinity and PSU. So, let's see. So, as you know, the salinity will vary from the top of the bay to the lower part of the bay. This upper part of the bay is, again, disproportionately impacted by freshwater inflows out of the San Jacinto and Trinity rivers. Now, this value here, 20 parts per thousand, is really, this would be something you'd see typically after an extended dry period in the Trinity River watershed, across the watershed. This, I think, is relatively high to what I would typically see up there, especially over the last several years, where you may see water salinities up there in the single digits. And certainly, or maybe the lower double digits. So 20 is relatively high for that part of the bay. Again, this is the value you put it in here to show you that that value is gonna vary. As you get down towards the lower part of the bay, especially once you get past this pinch point here between Eagle Point and Smith Point, where Redfish Reef historically transversed, right? this still represents a bottleneck. Once you get past this point, then the salinity is more significantly influenced by inflows through or from the Gulf of Mexico through these passes. And again, I'll draw your attention up here to rollover pass. So this graphic shows rollover pass still in place. And you can see why there was concern because there was quite a bit of salt water that got through that pass. And it had a substantial impact on the salinity here on the very east end of East Bay. Same thing down here at San Luis Pass. You can see the impact that has on that end of West Bay, even with water from Chocolate Bayou here finding its way into that end of the bay. So, we have this gradient here, and actually, if I can work this, let me see if I can do this here. Let me do a new share, and we will see. Let's see here. Let's do a new one here. Let's do let's do this one. Yeah, here we go. All right. Hopefully you can see that. So you should see a live map here. It's on my other screen. So I'm sorry, I'm looking away from you. But what this is a map that shows and forecasts. This shows and forecasts salinities within Galveston Bay. And I'd like to thank Christina for that. One of your classmates shared this with me, and I had forgotten about it. But in any event, so it's animated, which I really like. And you can see this through NOAA. And you can see here that the salinities are changing even along the coast on the beach side of the island. But you can see here an outflow occurring and the salinities are falling. And then what's happening here? All right, so we have a little bit of inflow. Now we've got an outflow. All right, so we got some water going out. And you can see time elapsing down here. Right here, we've got water moving in and out over time. And to some extent, that is tidal flows, right? So when the water's moving back up in there, that's the Gulf of Mexico pushing back on Galveston Bay. And you can see the salinity can extend back up in there when the tide starts to fall again. Remember, we have semi-diurnal tides in the bay. So you've got these tides that are moving in and out. Also, though, we've got water flowing out of these rivers. And so what the water volume coming out of those rivers can really impact how effective that tide is at pushing salt into the bay. So this is a fun animation, and you can spend some time on here. I'll put the link here in the slide. I want to call out that you can see that the salinity here is represented in PSU. As I said, that's more and more common. Many of our instruments now are starting to have those sort of representations. Okay, let me go back now to the original here. All right, now you should see me on my slides. Okay, so I hope all this works here. All right, so here's that link if you'd like to check that out for yourself. Okay, so so these flows, right, along with the physical features of the bay, affect the hydrology. One of the things that we look at when we look at hydrology is we're looking at the residence time of the water in the bay. Okay, and typically this is, in an estuary, this is going to be from where freshwater inflows are coming in. So Trinity, San Jacinto rivers, that north side, I'm sorry, the northwest furthest portions of the bay out to where they exit out into the Gulf of Mexico. In a short residence time, typically a large fraction of nutrients from the rivers are exported out into coastal waters. So when we have a big rain event, so here in the last few weeks, we've had a lot of rain. And that's pushed quite a few nutrients out of the rivers into Galveston Bay itself, but can actually even push those out into the Gulf of Mexico. You see this also with bacteria. So one of the things that happens in a lot of our inland bayous is that during the summer months, they're very warm, they're very nutrient rich, And in part, they're nutrient rich because they are not flowing a lot of water. During the dry part of the summer, there's not a lot of water moving through those. In fact, you could say in some of these bayous, a lot of the water flow is actually wastewater treatment effluent. Now, that's clean effluent that's coming out of those wastewater treatment plants in terms of nutrients and that kind of thing. But nonetheless, it's not a lot of flow. So the water is relatively stagnant. And that's a great place for bacteria to grow. Okay. So we get a big rainstorm, big flush of water that flushes those bayous and streams and the rivers out. And if it's strong enough, it'll actually push that water with the nutrients and bacteria out along the beach fronts. So here in Galveston, when we have a beach closure, it is most of the time bacteria, and they want to minimize that exposure for people with weakened immune systems, elderly, children, that sort of thing, who normally wouldn't be swimming in the bayous but would go out on the beachfront. So they'll close the beaches until those bacteria levels come back down, and that usually occurs when the rain ebbs and there's enough time for dilution to occur from the Gulf of Mexico. So it's not just nutrients, it's bacteria. But for habitat and some of the fisheries values and that sort of thing we're going to talk about, then these nutrients play an important role. So again, short residence times typically leads to those, really typically leads to those things pushing out, those nutrients pushing out. Long residence times, that water is sitting there for a long time. And so you'll see those nutrients are maintained and then actually utilized by microorganisms. Now, I just use the example of pathogenic bacteria, things like E. coli and others. But this is also true for a variety of different planktonic organisms, phytoplankton, that utilize those nutrients. And there can be value to that because those phytoplankton are, in fact, food for other organisms, right? But then too much, everything in balance, all right? So generally, long residence time systems um, are very susceptible to large scale changes in nutrient inputs. And that's because they tend to get these big slugs of water that come through when we have these big rain events, or they tend to be monsoonal, right? So you get a lot of rain in one part of the year and then not any rain in the other part of the year. Okay. Galveston Bay, for the most part, has pretty good mixing. Um, but we do have, when we have droughts like we had last year, you can see nutrient contents really move up in the bay. So let's look at an example of different residence times here. So here we're talking about, these are Lagrangian residence times. I'm sure I'm pronouncing that wrong, but typically here, okay, so let's look at an example of some of these residence times. So here you're seeing residence times over different periods of time, different months, right? And you could see shorter residence times occurring in April, typical for us because that our springs tend to bring a lot of rain, right? May to a little bit of a lesser extent, so you can see the residence times are longer in these darker red shades. The bluer shades and greens are shorter residence times. And then when we get over here to June, you can see that the residence times have climbed even more because now we're starting to get into that drier pattern in the summer. We'll see sea breeze showers coming off the Gulf. We don't see big rain events that are pushing water down through the rivers. So the consequence of that is that nutrient buildup can occur in these areas that have the highest residence times. Now you can see in the middle part of the bay here, we still maintain relatively low residence times because of the freshwater flows that are finding their way here, plus the exchange, which is fairly significant through Bolivar Roads where the Houston Ship Channel is. So it's not uniform across the bay as a whole. And we're going to touch back on this because there's some additional impacts to that. All right. So let's talk now about, let's shift gears a little bit, talk about habitats. Because again, hydrology affects the habitats that are present. So, we're going to talk about three primary habitats today. We're going to talk about wetlands, the benthic habitats, which are in the sediments, and or yeah, sediments and soils. You'll oftentimes hear those terms intertwined. So, sediments are just submerged soils, and then in the water column itself. There we go. So let's talk about wetlands first. So wetlands are defined as having three, you can call these diagnostic features. Okay. When I do wetland work, especially if I'm doing something for a client that maybe wants to identify where a wetland is, delineate where a wetland is, and or determine if a wetland is present, we're looking for specific key indicators a lot of times that are defining of wetland environments. And those three things are water tolerant vegetation, often referred to as hydric vegetation. Okay. And so these are plants that are specifically adapted to life in the water. Now, we've talked about a number of these. In fact, in your labs, you've seen quite a few of them. Um, Hydric vegetation occurs across continents. Okay, so this isn't just a coastal plant community phenomena. In fact, it occurs clear up in the very central part of the Midwest. When good grief, I grew up in Missouri and Kansas, so eastern Kansas, western Missouri, and we had hybrid vegetation in wetlands in areas that you didn't see a lot of, typically see a lot of water. The soils don't have to be saturated for long periods of time in order for the soils to be modified, thus requiring the plants to be modified. So that leads me to the second thing, which is inundated or saturated soils or sediments. Now, again, these are oftentimes referred to as hydric soils. And so these sediments, and there's where you see those two things cross over, hydric soils, sediments, right? They're analogous for one another. Um, so these sediments, they in some systems will be saturated all the time. So if we're talking about seagrasses, right? These are submerged, they're always underwater. As you go up slope, as the elevation increases, the amount of saturation in many instances will increase. In our prairie pothole wetlands that are found across much of Galveston, Brazoria, Chambers counties along the coast, they may be saturated for part of the year and then they dry out for part of the year. They're still hydric soils because they're saturated for a long enough period of time that the soils are modified in a way that forces modification of the plants that will tolerate those soils. Okay. Um, and the soils specifically are reduced. Okay, so in these instances, they're anoxic, they're lacking oxygen. And so the bacteria and other organisms that live in those sediments are, or those hydric soils, have to be able to survive in these low oxygen environments. Okay. Again, these can be saltwater, freshwater, coastal, inland, they can be all over the place. And there, we've seen some of these examples. I showed you a little bit over the last week what some of those hydric soils look like. There's some production of hydrogen sulfide, and as it's reduced, it changes the sediments. So you'll have these kind of black tinges to the sediments. You will let's see, what else am I showing here? Actually, that's some of my students on one of my coastal research projects, collecting specimens for biomass. Um, there's a lot going on in this slide. I don't like animation, so you get it all at once. But here's what's happening here. What I'm aiming to show you is that even just around Galveston Bay, there is a tremendous amount of different types of wetlands that are occurring here. Some of these are coastal. So, for instance, this one down here in the bottom right-hand corner is a coastal low marsh. This is very much like the one that is right there, demonstration marsh that's there on the Texas A&M Galveston campus. So you've got Spartina alterniflora, aka is it Spirabolus alterniflorus. along with Distichus and other species, right? And so these are not only wetland plants, but they're specifically, you're going to find saltwater wetland plants. And those will occupy large swaths of these coastal environments on both sides of the barrier islands, right? If you go inland just a little ways, you might find slightly modified versions of these coastal wetlands, and oftentimes they're tied to mid and high marsh habitats that are fairly close to the water. So the elevation changes is a little more severe and occurs over a shorter distance from the water edge into the high marsh. So this photo I took up at Smith Point. This photo I took down here in coastal Brazoria County, and there are coastal pothole wetlands in here, right? And so you'll see these, and there's more up here again in Chambers County. In fact, they stretch the whole Texas coast. So just going in a little ways from Galveston Island, you have yet again a different set of wetlands. And while my blue oval here doesn't extend, you'll actually find these low coastal wetlands extending way up into Galveston Bay, right? Um, Coupled to this, you'll find, especially when you get up where we have a lot of the larger rivers and bayous, you'll find these riparian corridors. A lot of times these have coastal bottomland forest attached to them in these. So you'll have the immediate proximity is riparian forest. And a lot of times it has a lot of hardwoods associated with it. And then immediately adjacent to it, that'll extend back into these coastal bottomlands, especially down here when you get into lower Brazoria County. Again, have a lot of hardwoods in them, but then you have a lot of softer wood trees like ash and hackberry and those types of trees. And so these are very wooded environments. Oftentimes they are saturated, at least for part of the year. So depending on, the rainy season, you might go in there and you might have a few inches of water and actually see water lines along the bottom of the trees. You can see this if you go to the Armand Bayou Nature Center and wander around in there. You can see where there's a water line in where where there's standing water along those trees. Get up a little further, and I took this picture in Jesse Jones State Park. And so this is a cypress swamp, and we do have swamps in the Galveston Bay area as well. So I wanted to show you all of these features together because one of the important things I really want you to start to conceptualize is that all of these habitats are interconnected with one another. Each habitat isn't like Las Vegas where whatever happens there stays there. What happens in these cypress swamps has a direct and important impact on all of these other habitats. Same thing with the coastal prairies, same thing with these coastal marshes. All of these things are interconnected, forming a mosaic of different habitat types. And that includes the upland areas that aren't wetlands at all, right? All of these things are interlinked with one another. In fact, and we're going to come back to this a little later in the semester, but this paper is authored by a friend of mine, a couple of friends of mine, actually, John Jacob and Andy Sippets. Andy works with Texas Parks and Wildlife. And they actually did a study in the Armand Bayou Nature Center linking these riparian forested wetlands to the functions of Armand Bayou proper. And linked them to water quality, flooding, and those kind of things. So we'll look at this a little more in depth as we go. Ha ha ha. Flooding in depth. Come on, that's funny. Okay. So, all right. So benthic habitats are interesting as well. So benthic habitats. We've talked about oysters before, and oysters are a really important part of our aquatic habitat in Galveston Bay. They're essentially analogous in many ways to coral reefs, right? So if you think about the Flower Garden Banks National Marine Sanctuary, they function in kind of somewhat similarly. They provide a lot of hard structure, a lot of important habitat for pelagic organisms. So these are fish and other organisms like crabs, blue crab being a really good example, that spend part of their time out in the Gulf of Mexico, and then they come in to lay eggs or to reproduce in the wetlands. But oftentimes they use those oyster reef as part of that. So these reefs are so important, in fact, that there has been quite a bit of effort put into restoring those reefs using a variety of methods. This is just happens to be one method using reef balls. So these are actually made from recycled ash from power plants. And so they recycle this to form a concrete that then can be sunk, and it's a hard surface that the oyster spout can attach to, and then you can get a reef from that. And in the meantime, they also help provide as a or, pardon me, function as a breakwater essentially for these coastal wetlands. Then there's also seagrass habitats are really important, and open bay bottom. And I'm not really going to talk a whole lot about open bay bottom, but these seagrass habitats are really important in terms of fishery habitat. In part, they function much like intertidal wetlands in some ways. So they're helping diffuse oxygen, they are helping modify sediments, they're providing structure for fish and other smaller organisms to feed. So they're again part of that productivity of the bay as a whole. Now, seagrasses historically in Galveston Bay were hit fairly hard during the from about the 1950s into the really into the 2000s. Part of that had to do with channelization in the bay, so cutting in, for instance, along the backside of Galveston Island, cutting in boat channels that increase boat traffic in a very shallow area where the sediments are quite small grain, meaning that they tend to get resuspended very easily into the water column. That had the effect of not only shading out the light within the water column itself, but when those sediments settle back down, they would settle on the plants themselves, and that has a detrimental effect to the plant's ability to photosynthesize. So again, there have been quite a bit of seagrass restoration efforts in Galveston Bay, especially in West Bay. But there's also been quite a recovery of seagrasses around Galveston Bay, in part because of efforts taken to improve water quality, to really minimize prop wash and restrict some areas where boats can go where there are those sensitive habitats. These are students that years ago when I was with the Galveston Bay Foundation, we had worked with NOAA on a monitoring program for seagrasses down in Christmas Bay, which if you want to see seagrass, that is a great place to see them. But again, I'm starting to see them and even in some of our restored areas along West Galveston Island where they're coming back. We've seen some up here around the Trinity recently as well. So again, things are on the improved, they're improving in the Galveston Bay system, and I'm really happy about that. Those seagrasses also provide, I think I mentioned this, but they also provide habitat for a lot of microorganisms, again, which are important to the food web and also nutrients. Speaking of benthic sediments, so a lot of my personal work is with benthic macroinvertebrates. I thought I would show you a few of these. There are quite a wide array of these that again have a whole variety of ecologic niches that are important to the function of the bay. Some of them are burrowers, and they are important in terms of nutrient cycling. Some of them are in some cases, they are transient predators, so they're not high trophic level organisms, but within benthic macroinvertebrates, they're relatively high, and they feed on other benthos to control populations. And there are a variety of different types. So I'm going to talk just about three real briefly here. Polychaetes, and poly means many, and chaete means leg. So you've got these benthic macroinvertebrates that have many legs. You have, in many cases, you can see there they have feeding palps that either they are feeding on sediments with. In some cases, they're using them for things like Alida here. So Alida this is one of those transient organisms that oftentimes they're kind of like ribbon worms. If you're familiar with ribbon worms, they're in that same kind of classification. They feed, they're kind of transient, and they're hunters. So we also have oligochaetes. Oligo means few or none, and oligochaetes have no legs or hairs. Also, chaete can mean hair. So you've got these oligochaetes that have few or no hairs. These are related actually to earthworms are a type of oligochaete. Okay, so these are aquatic versions, and again, there are a lot of different species of oligochaetes. Oligochaetes are often in our base system an indicator of low oxygen environments, and as a consequence, they can be a good indicator for where you might have a higher than background level amount of organic um, uh, chemicals, oftentimes anthropogenic in nature. So they're a good pollutant indicator, especially where you have very high numbers of oligochaetes and very few of other types of organisms because they are very pollution tolerant. Um, and then here we have some roundworms. And so these are nematodes. And a lot of people are familiar with nematodes as terrestrial soil organisms, and they can become actually parasitic to a variety of different animals, including us, and under some circumstances. These are aquatic nematodes. Again, there are a lot of different species of them. They're primarily burrowers. And then, of course, there are a pretty wide variety of different types of crustaceans. So everything from gastropods to copepods, amphipods, ostracods. These guys are really neat. These are some of my favorite organisms. You'll find these in the sediments, and they're semi-demersal, so you'll actually find them on the surface just a little bit. And they're kind of neat because they've got this hinged shell with the organism inside. And then we also have insects, aquatic insects, primarily midge larvae. So these are chironomids. And again, there are a lot of different species of midges that inhabit our coastal marshes in the Galveston Bay area. So there are a lot of different species of these chironomids. And again, chironomids in many instances can be indicators of low oxygen environments because those midges tend to like really still, relatively stagnant water. In any event, these benthic habitats are an important part of the function. There's a lot happening under there as part of what I'm trying to communicate to you. There are a lot of organisms in there, both plant and animal, doing a lot of different things, all coming together as a really important part of the biologic community that makes up Galveston Bay. Okay, so another one occurs up in the water column. So, obviously we're all familiar with finfish, all right? But there are other organisms that are much lower down in their trophic positions that are equally or maybe even more important in some ways. And these would be phytoplankton. So phytoplankton, so plankton means organisms that they're not really swimming on their own. They're moving with the currents, right? Oyster spat is planktonic. It moves and then it kind of settles out wherever it is. There are a number of zooplankton, a lot of animal type plankton. But phytoplankton are interesting because they do photosynthesize. And phytoplankton are really important because they're an important food source, very bottom of the food web in the bay system. But they can also be problematic and a good indicator of other problems when those numbers get to be really high. We measure phytoplankton kind of the same way we measure or some aspects of productivity in terrestrial plants or coastal wetland plants. You'll probably see over the course of the semester, you'll be using some chlorophyll meters, right? Either SPAD meters or like versions of those. And they measure chlorophyll in the leaf. And that's one of the ways we can tell about how productive that plant is. Well, these phytoplankton likewise produce chlorophyll. And so we can measure chlorophyll A as a measure of productivity. Now, these plankton are way too small to do that with a SPAD meter, but nonetheless. And so actually, there's a really good researcher at Texas A&M Galveston, Antoinette Quigg, who does this research extensively in Galveston Bay. It's authored a number of papers. There are others as well. I'm probably most familiar with her work, but in any event, when we look at chlorophyll A measurements across the bay, one of the things, so this is from a paper um, by Dr. Liu, and what you're seeing here is changes in, so if you look at the scale over here, I'm going to turn where I can see my bigger screen. So here, what you're seeing is, cursor back over here. Okay, so what you're seeing here is your scale, right? And so this is micrograms per liter, all the way from none to very high, right? So over 33 micrograms per liter. And you're seeing kind of a time lapse here. So the amount of chlorophyll measured in different parts of the bay over time. And much like residence time, which does in fact have an impact on the phytoplankton and chlorophyll A productivity, there are a number of things that affect, pardon me, how much chlorophyll there is. Part of it is the nutrients. Again, in a system that has longer residence time, you're probably going to have more nutrients there. So typically, under most circumstances, you would expect to see greater concentrations of phytoplankton in those areas as well, producing that chlorophyll, right? So, but there's a lot happening in the bay, and residence times are affected by those water inflows, as we talked about, and you can actually see that. And then there's also the shape of the bay itself, because the bay is not a uniform shape, just a straight line from the rivers down to the Gulf of Mexico. You've got these pockets all around it, right? So you can see, you've got this big area up around Trinity Bay, you've got this area now down in East Bay that no longer has a saltwater input going into it. So you've got a lot of things happening here in different parts of the bay. So the amount of phytoplankton that are going to be present in any given area are going to be affected by the physical features, the bathymetry, the freshwater inflows, which all kind of affects that residence time and the amount of nutrients that are present. So I like this graph that was part of this study, this 2019 study, and in part because it captures Hurricane Harvey. But you can see here across time the inflows from the Trinity and San Jacinto rivers as it goes through here. And you can also see the volumes of, or I'm sorry, the concentrations rather, of chlorophyll A. And so you've got this graphically, and you can see over the winter, the amount of chlorophyll that's being produced is somewhat lower on a relative scale. Why would that be? Well, part of it could be water inflow. Part of it could be the water is going to be colder and there's going to be lesser sunlight. So these being plants, they're going to be less productive in those periods. Even going into, so like our low marsh plants go into senescence. So the plants essentially, all of the biomass above the water line dies off, and the plant is still alive underneath there, but it's in its senescence. So the same thing happens with these phytoplankton in a sense, in that they really slow down, right? So you're not getting as much chlorophyll production as a result. As you start to get into the spring and the daylight starting to increase, there's nutrients are another part of this. So where you have growing seasons in the watershed as a whole, right? As you have these growing seasons occurring, there are nutrients that wash off of the land. They're incorporated in the soils as a natural component of the soils, but they're also applied to ag lands, to urban environments, and to a great extent, they're water soluble. So, how much of those find their way into the water column can affect other plants like phytoplankton, right? I mean, in their essence, they're still plants. So, they're going to utilize those nutrients that are going to help them build biomass. And so you start to see more inputs in this time of the year. But again, then there's also the factor of water flow. So you can see here, it's kind of interesting when you try and pair these things up. And the water flow out of the Trinity River has an impact on the amount of phytoplankton, but it's not immediate. So you'll see a little bit of, oh, pardon me, you'll see a little bit of a lag that occurs. So after you have a high water flow event, you'll get a little bit of a lag. It'll be up, right, and down. And it somewhat parallels these, it somewhat parallels the flows, But again, there's a little bit of a lag time that occurs there. As that gets flushed out, that'll go. The plankton are going to follow the water just like the nutrients do. They're not going to swim there and kind of stay where they're put. So this is really important because it's a very dynamic environment. And so tracking this and determining where you're going to have these highly productive organisms is it's a real trick. I mean, it's a real trick, and I don't profess to be any sort of expert at it at all. There are more qualified people, and if you want to know a lot about it, I'd suggest go find these nice people that work there at A&M, and I'm sure they'll give you some good information. Okay. Oh, your first clicker question, right? Now I'm going to talk about it here. So, where might you expect to find water column chlorophyll A concentrations to be the highest in this particular image? Now, remember, this image is looking at residence time. So here again, you're seeing we've got our highest residence times in these over here in East Bay and down here in West Bay. A little bit up here in the upper part of the Trinity, all right? So if I were going to answer this question, I think the darkest color and the most prevalent dark color is going to be here in East Bay, where there's just not a lot of movement during the summer months. Okay. But again, so that would be the correct answer if you were going to put it in here. I would also accept to a lesser extent this far end of West Bay and then this upper part of Trinity Bay. But again, there's a lot happening here, right? So you've got some seasonal things going on, both in terms of light and temperature, in terms of water flow. In this particular set of data, it captured, and by the way, this time frame and these time frames are not the same. This is just an example. But you can see when we're looking at chlorophyll values that where you have where you have this high level of water flow after Hurricane Harvey, you have an impact there, right? So there's a lot happening here as a result of this. Okay, so what's in the state of the bay right now? What's in the state of the bay? So, well, those are some of my students actually in an early study. This is probably 15 years ago. Over in Pierce Marsh in Galveston County, just outside of Hitchcock. So, kind of over in this part of the bay. So, we talked a little bit about the state of the bay previously, but you can learn a lot about it. I'm going to give you a link here where you can go find this on your own. So, part of this, we talked about nutrients in the bay. One of the big nutrients that you see referred to in a lot of bay and lake systems is phosphorus. Phosphorus was really a problem in the 70s and 80s, largely as a result of partly because of fertilizers, right? So fertilizers are primarily composed of nitrogen and phosphorus, but also to even a greater extent in the 70s and 80s from detergents. So detergents like dishwashing detergent, for example, and laundry detergent had high levels of phosphorus, which made them excellent at cleaning. But they also tended to stay, they're very water soluble. They tended to stay in the water, have long residence times, and led to eutrophication, for instance, in the Great Lakes, was a real problem in the Great Lakes, and are a problem as it applies to eutrophication even in the Gulf of Mexico, right? So, we have that big dead zone, essentially, oh gosh, the word is escaping me. Hydrophobic zone, not hydrophobic zone, good gracious. Okay, so what's the state of the bay? What's the state of the bay? Right? Okay. Actually, these are students of mine from a past study. This was probably about 15 years ago up in Pierce Marsh. Yeah. So this is up by Hitchcock, kind of over in this area here. All right, so we've talked quite a bit about the state of the bay in the earlier part of this presentation, but there are a couple areas I still want to touch on. One of those has to do with water quality, both nitrogen and phosphorus. Nitrogen and phosphorus are the primary components of fertilizers. And so if you go to any garden store, hardware store, whatever, you look at fertilizer, it's going to be mostly nitrogen and phosphorus. There are trace elements in there sometimes. And so those fertilizers, like we talked about previously, are very water soluble, and they can find their way in runoff into our rivers, into the bay proper, and can cause overgrowth of aquatic plants, of phytoplankton, and other even bacteria. And the bacteria in particular are problematic because they can really use up the oxygen in the water and cause hypoxia. And that hypoxia then can lead to significant impacts to other aspects of the community. So the good news is the amount of nitrogen and phosphorus in the bay is declining. Nitrogen, in fact, we've done really well with nitrogen. Phosphorus has been a little tougher nut to crack, in part because phosphorus is used in a variety of other things. So, for instance, in the 70s and 80s, phosphorus was used extensively in detergents. So things like laundry detergent, dish detergent had high levels of phosphorus in it because it accelerated the cleaning process and really made those better cleaners, right? And so, but the problem was, again, they stay water soluble and they are a really important food nutrient. In fact, phosphorus is typically the limiting nutrient for most plant communities. So essentially, when plants don't have either enough nitrogen or phosphorus, that shuts down the amount of biomass that they're going to produce. So typically, phosphorus is the limiting nutrient. And so if you have an excess of phosphorus, there's no limiting nutrient for those plants because there's usually an abundance of nitrogen anyway. And so those plants will just continue to grow, and that creates a cascade effect. So definitely improvement occurring in the bay system, and that's good. Part of that is phosphorus had been removed from detergents. So that's why when you go to the grocery store and you pick up dishwashing detergent or laundry detergent, you'll see phosphorus free all over it. So know that they actually have to do that, and they're not doing you a favor. They're required to do that. But nonetheless, it is having a really significant positive impact on the bay itself. In terms of freshwater inflows, where you see these years where we have the light blue, right? So in these guys here, we had adequate or excellent freshwater inflows that really match the need of the bay system. In these others, especially as you get into the dark greens, these are where we're not meeting those needs. And freshwater inflows are a really important part of the function of the bay, as you've seen over the last couple of weeks. So there's a lot of concern about the amount of effluent from the rivers. Of course, there's more stress on our rivers. The populations are continuing to grow. That means more water needed for municipal water supplies. There's also more manufacturing. Manufacturing takes water. Agriculture takes water. So everybody gets their part. And in fact, in terms of permitting, not too many years ago, the water coming into Galveston Bay through the San Jacinto River was up to 70% of it was permitted for these types of uses, right? So 70% of the water coming down the river was spoken for. That was troubling. I served for a few years with Houston Advanced Research Center helping with the Galveston Bay Freshwater Inflows Group, which was a program of the Galveston Bay Estuary Program. And there were a lot of discussions and modeling and negotiations that took place trying to manage those inflows because that has a significant impact on that saltwater gradient. Oystermen, as you might imagine, I remember well, there were a number of oyster families in this area. I won't name them, but that made their way to those meetings because they were concerned about that saltwater gradient that's really important for oyster productivity, but it's important for a wide variety of these aquatic habitats. And you can see where you have problems with that. You need only go down to the I'm sorry, Brownsville, and you can see where the river's supposed to outflow, and it actually backs up from the Gulf of Mexico into the Rio Grande. This is what we want to avoid, right? We don't want our bay system to become hypersaline and completely change the nature of the makeup of the bay. So there's a lot of interest in this. Of course, rainfall is another factor, and with changing rainfall patterns here in Texas and elsewhere, and in general, our rainfall in the upper part of the watershed tends to be going down, and so west of us, rainfall amounts tend to be reducing, whereas east on this end, the rainfall amounts tend to be increasing. That complicates the flow and changes that a little bit. But by and large, you can see that most of our years were C or better. So that's something. So I would say that this is still relatively, we're doing relatively well in that regard. We looked at inorganic toxins previously, and in general, I would say the improvements here have been pretty substantial. I think the Bay is much different than it was 40, 50 years ago. Heck, it's much different than it was when I started my career. Not to say we still don't have problems, and we do have some really significant issues. We talked about dioxins and PCBs, mercury. These are areas where we've got legacy pollutants, and in some cases, some new inputs that are still causing significant problems, and these include human health concerns. So we definitely want to be alert to that. But the trends here across the board are good. And so that's very positive. And so speaking for myself, I'm very happy about that. Um, but again, there are still those legacy pollutants. I want to focus here on metals for a minute because so here we've got um, two different sets of years, right? So you've got this is an average between 2004 and 2017, and you could see the percent of samples because we talked about mercury, right? So you could see the percentage of samples that exceeded the state standards for mercury, and that was almost a quarter of the samples that were taken, 25% of them, right? Flash forward, not very far here. I mean, we're talking just, what is it, about 5, 6 years. And you can see that that number has gone from 25% down to just a little over 6% for mercury in terms of the number of samples that are exceeding state standards. That is a really big improvement. Part of that speaks to better controls on mercury. Part of it speaks to ongoing changes in terms of sediment loads. Sometimes contaminants can get covered by other clean contaminants. That's a good thing because they become far less bioavailable that way. But storm event could change that. So we could see this change over time. I wouldn't necessarily call this a trend. I would say that this is a good finding, but it'd be something to keep your eye on as we move forward. Okay, we talked about sea level rise. This is an ongoing problem. I can tell you that my friends at the Port of Houston are very concerned about this and taking a lot of steps to um, uh, essentially armor their facilities in a way that's going to allow them to continue to be productive and maintain their targets as the sea level continues to creep higher over time. Because those higher sea levels make us more susceptible to storm surge, to erosion, to those kind of things. So, but it's an issue we all have to pay attention to because the nature of the coast is changing and it's going to continue to change. This is not something I think that is going to turn around anytime soon. This is something that you're going to deal with certainly in your lifetime, as I have in mine. And climate change is a thing. And so as that water continues to warm up and expand, storms are likely to get stronger. I think there's still some stuff out there in terms of where the storms are going that we don't quite have a full understanding yet. The modeling is continuing to get better. So again, looking at what hurricane modeling is today versus when I was in high school, I remember living through Hurricane Alicia, and 3 days out, nobody knew where that storm was going in the Gulf of Mexico. Now, 3 days out, you can pinpoint it to about 100 miles. So the modeling is tremendously better, but there's still things about these circulation patterns in the atmosphere and in the water that we're still learning. So this, that graph is frightening to me because of the potential risk that it poses to not only us, but to these important biologic communities on which we depend on. So keep an eye on that as we move forward. In terms of fish and wildlife, I have to say, here again, I think um, there have been some good gains, but there have been some significant losses as well. I think still the most critical thing where we have impacts on fish and wildlife has to do on habitat loss. There's still a lot of loss that occurs. The previous slide where we were looking at coastal changes related to sea level rise and subsidence, that's certainly part of it. Land conversion, we're going to talk about that a little bit later in the semester, where we lose some parts of the wetlands, that mosaic of wetlands that we talked about. And when you affect one part of the picture, it affects all the other parts of the picture. That's having some impact. So where I still think we are one of the most diverse and interesting places for wildlife anywhere in the country. Um, at the same time, relative to our history, we could still be doing better, right? There's still a lot of room for improvement here when you look at this. Now, I will say there are some really bright spots. Brown pelicans are a big deal. When I was a biologist at Sierra Loma Marine World in the 80s, we were working with brown pelicans because they were on the endangered species list. So we were captively breeding brown pelicans with an eye towards release. The biggest impact was the removal of DDT from the environment that occurred before that program that occurred in the 70s. And that removing the DDT from the environment really allowed those brown pelicans to rebound. They are an amazing case study in terms of not only the value of the things like the Endangered Species Act, but also other regulatory actions that focused on these problematic chemicals that have these long-lasting effects in the environment. So now you see brown pelicans everywhere, right? And speaking as someone who remembers when there were none, this is really a big deal. And so I'm really happy about that. But there's still a lot of room for improvement here, and I think you'll see that occur over time. So with that, I'm going to wrap up. So after this, you should be able to identify key geologic and hydrological features of the bay, including what a barrier island is, Cheniere Plain, salinity, major habitats, wetland benthic and open bay, understand some of the historical and current influences, anthropogenic influences or human influences on the ecosystem. And if you have any questions, of course, at any time, would like to discuss any of this in more detail, I resisted the urge to say more depth. So in more detail, I'd be happy to talk to you. So with that, thank you for your patience, and I look forward to seeing you next time.